Hello, I'm Senator Rod Grams, and welcome to the April edition of our Washington Report. Now, during the month of April, people are once again spending time outside enjoying the spring weather. The farmers are back to work in the fields, and of course, the baseball fans everywhere are full of hope that this could be their year. But for all the things we look forward to during this time of year, the one annual event that no one looks forward to is Tax Day. Well, today the federal government is taxing families at the highest level since World War II. Families are paying more in taxes than they do on food, shelter, and clothing combined. Now, Minnesotans need tax relief, and they're tired of giving so many of their hard-earned dollars to the government. And I think Congress needs to continue to push for meaningful tax relief, to cut wasteful spending, and try to reduce the size and scope and influence of the federal government. Well, my guest today on the show has led the Senate Republicans in working toward lower taxes, less government, more individual freedom. He is the United States Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott of Mississippi. Senator Lott, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome.
All right, it's good to be back. I did this show with you a few years ago, enjoyed it very much, and I'm glad to be with you again.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad of a lot of the progress that we have made.
Yeah. Well, you know, when I give speeches around my own state, around the country, I always start off now by reminding people of the good things that we have achieved. Back in 1997, we did have the $500 tax credit for families with children, for each child, the $500. You were the original sponsor of that idea. We cut the capital gains tax rate. We raised the exemption sum on the death tax. We still need to do a lot more there. We balanced the budget. We now have established a precedent that not a cent of Social Security money will be spent for anything but Social Security, and we started paying down the national debt. This year, we're going to do even more on the tax relief area. We're going to phase out the marriage penalty tax. My daughter got married last year, Rod, and all of a sudden she says, "Dad, you mean now that I'm married, even though my husband and I make the same amount, I'm going to be paying more taxes?"
That's right.
I said, "I'm afraid that's right, honey," and there's no way you can defend that, and we're going to eliminate that this year. I hope the president will sign it. And then also another thing we're going to do, we've been talking for years about how unfair it was to discourage our seniors between 65 and 69 from continuing to work if they want to by penalizing them, taking away part of the Social Security benefits. I believe that within the next month or so, we're going to, well, in fact, by the time we get this show on the air, we may actually have completed action on the Social Security earnings test, elimination of that penalty for people between 65 and 69.
Isn't it funny, when the president is opposed, it was a bad idea, but now all of a sudden it's a good idea that maybe we should allow or give the senior citizens an opportunity to continue working if they want. You know, there's such a wealth of information and the qualifying, the things they've done over their lifetime. To take them out of the workforce seems to be unfair. And many of them need the jobs, by the way, in order to supplement the retirement.
And we need them now.
That's right.
In certain areas of the country, we have employment problems for the first time in my own state. We're finding now we can't get the workers that we need, and some of them's in areas where our seniors could work part-time. It would really help them, and it would help the small business that might be looking for workers. But one other point that you made that's very important, Rod, we want to make the tax code fairer and simpler. And that's going to mean we're going to eventually have to have fundamental tax reform and scrap the tax code as it exists today. But there's another reason for doing all this, and it is to allow the families to keep more of their money, to decide what will be spent for their children in terms of their needs for education or clothing or whatever it may be. But it also helps with economic growth. Now we're in a period of good time economically, but we want to make sure that continues in the future. And the record is clear: when you reduce rates, or when you cut capital gains, the economy has a spurt.
Right.
It always has been that way.
In fact, I think the latest figures show that 35% of the surplus we're enjoying today is from the tax cut we passed in 1997.
No question.
So it's already, the surplus is larger, so that means the economic pie is getting bigger. Yeah. So the tax cut in 97 was a good investment into the economy.
No question about it. When we cut the capital gains tax rate the way we did, a lot of people that had been holding back and not selling and turning things over in the economy said, well, since they've reduced that capital gains tax rate significantly, they went ahead and started selling things. In fact, I'm going to do that myself. I'm going to be selling some family timber this year. But it still is something you have to think about. Well, gosh, I'm going to have to pay such a percentage of it for taxes. Should I maybe wait till later and let my kids get a greater benefit without the taxes?
Okay. Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, when you mentioned your daughter getting married and now realizing the higher tax, and I had a young couple come up to me about 5 years ago, and this is why we really started supporting the marriage penalty, was because they figured it out, and their tax was like $2,400, a little higher than the average. The average is about $1,400. But couples out there, and it's about half the married couples in the country that are facing this form of unfair taxation. Another tax is the estate tax, the death tax. That's also on our list of trying to get done.
I was speaking to a Chamber of Commerce banquet back in December while I was home, and after it was over, a lady came up to me, obviously not a wealthy lady, and not that old. I'd say she was in her late 30s, and she was in tears. And she said, my mother and father both died last year, and we have the family farm. Which is, I think that they said maybe 250 acres or something like that. But because of tax considerations, she and her brother were going to have to sell the family farm, which had been in the family that was been 3 generations, to pay the taxes, the estate taxes, because of their mother and father's death. And she was in tears because it wasn't fair. They didn't want to have to sell it, but she said, we don't have any money. And so we're going to, rather than borrow and go into that kind of debt, we're going to wind up having to sell the farm. That story is replicated all across this country. It's people that own a few 100 acres of farmland. They're not wealthy. People that own a small business that would like to pass that on to their children without the government coming in and taking 40%, 45% of it.
50%.
50%. I mean, that is really unfair.
And like you say, a lot of times we hear the charges that it's only a tax cut for the rich. But so many times when you hear these kind of stories, these are average farmers, small business people. That means they're going to have to sell their business or their farm of 3, 4 generations.
I tell you another thing that's happening in my state, and probably Minnesota too. I'm finding now that 2nd and 3rd generation small business, a company maybe that has been a soft drink bottling company. The current owner looks at the estate tax situation and decides, well, even though it's been in the family 2 generations and it's not really a big business, I could actually probably get more of my children if I go ahead and sell it now. And they sell out to, Coca-Cola in Atlanta. And get out of the bottling business. And I know several instances. We had a cat food plant that had been in a family, a Croatian family, by the way, named Marver for years. They sold out because they finally decided that they could do more for their children in the long run by going ahead and selling. And you hate to see that.
Well, you always hate to see those type of business decisions made because of the tax code. Not what's good for the business or for your family or your heirs, but you make the decision based on what's good for how you're going to get around the
But all these things are in the bill that we passed last year, Rod, and the president vetoed it. And he got away with it because we allowed it to just become a debate about the amount of the tax cut. Now, this was a tax cut that did not affect the Social Security, would not have affected having a balanced budget, but over a 10-year period would have provided the people with about $872 billion in tax cuts. That became the debate. It was about the number.
That's right.
This year we learned a little lesson. We're going to explain to the people, we're talking about eliminating the marriage penalty tax. We're talking about eliminating the Social Security earnings test. We're talking about continuing to phase out the death tax. So things that people really do agree with, but other things too, like encouraging people to adopt children with an adoption tax credit, encouraging people to keep their seniors at home with them and give them a tax credit. A whole long list of things.
Healthcare, education accounts, retirement, all of that was buried in the bill. And like you said, when I would go back home and hold town meetings and tell them the different taxes that were in there, tax relief measures, everybody would shake their head, yes, they supported it. But they would start out by saying, no, we shouldn't have that kind of tax cut. One other important part about this whole debate on the surplus and if we should have tax relief, of course, is the lockbox because of Social Security. I've introduced a bill called the Graham's Lockbox that would set aside that if the estimates on revenue and spending didn't match, and rather than spending into the Social Security surplus, we would cut across the board to reduce spending in all categories, even if it was only 1/2 of 1%. Because our promise is not to spend a dime of Social Security. But the other lockbox that we've introduced also is to set aside all Social Security funds. Now, this is very important.
Well, your legislation, by the way, Rod, it makes good common sense. It's a simple solution to what can be a big problem or a small problem. If you reach a point where if some action is not taken, you'll have money have to come out of Social Security. You just do it across the board reduction. It makes sense. We did that last year, as a matter of fact, to help make sure that we didn't touch a penny of Social Security. At the end of the session, we did have a small across-the-board cut. It had very little effect
That's
on
right.
any program, agency, or department. But it was that extra precaution to make sure. And by the way, this is not insignificant. This was a major achievement last year when we actually succeeded with the lockbox on Social Security. Because since 1965, when Lyndon Johnson was trying to come up with enough money for spending on guns and butter, he started to dipping into Social Security by calling it as part of the whole of the general budget. And since 1965, we have been spending on a variety of programs, Social Security Trust Fund, FICA tax money. Now that's wrong. And last year we set the precedent that we're not going to do that anymore. That is really big for the future of Social Security and for the condition of the economy, because if we don't spend that Social Security money, which we shouldn't for anything but Social Security, then until we need it, it actually reduces the annual debt by that amount of money. It's a big achievement.
And we need to pay off the debt. That's important. Lock away the Social Security Trust Fund money. And again, I hold town meetings that I know as you do, and the people out there just think this is things that we need to do and should continue to do.
Absolutely.
We talked briefly, Trent, about the tax code itself, and I agree with you. I think we need to pull it out by the roots and replace it. Now, this is maybe a little bit long-term. Tax cuts in the short term we need to do to relieve the tax burden, but we also need to be thinking. We did a little bit with the IRS reforms, but I always say it's like putting lipstick on a pig. You can't make it pretty by doing that. So would you support efforts to really look at getting rid of the tax code overall?
Absolutely, I would. That's why it's so important this year who we elect to Congress, the House and the Senate and the President, because we do have an opportunity with the economy the way it is, and with the problems we've already addressed, like welfare reform, where we've gotten 50% of the people on welfare, off of welfare, into a job, by the way. They went through training and education, they're getting jobs. But there are a couple of big things we still need to do. We need to make sure Social Security is reformed in a way it'll be there for my grandson.
That's right.
We need to make sure that we reform Medicare so it'll be there at least for my children's lives. And now it's solvent through, I think, 2013 or 2015, something like that. We need to make sure that it's going to be okay for at least 50 years. And then the other really big thing that we'll have the chance to do in the next 2 or 3 years is fundamental tax reform. I mean, I ask people when I go around the country, do you think the tax code is too complicated? Well, of course.
Yes.
Do you think it's fair? Absolutely not. Do you think it's time we do something fundamental about it? Yes. And then the question is, okay, then what? And of course, there's the flat rate tax proposal, and then there is the national consumption tax type proposal. I think we ought to have a national dialogue about that, think about it, make sure we've considered all the contingencies that might develop, and then make a decision. Go with a fairer, simpler, flatter tax code that people will honor. And I'd like for us to come up with a system that get at the underground economy too. So much money now is escaping the taxation because of the code that we have in place.
Yeah, it encourages that.
Yeah.
So nobody likes to pay taxes, but there's a lot of good things that we need to do with government. When we talk about reforms, everybody thinks we want to get rid of the federal government. That's not true. But we want to make it a better government that's leaner, meaner, and more effective.
Right. The federal government has some clear roles. Obviously, to defend the freedom that we care so much about. Strong national defense. We have to have a good interstate highway system. I have supported the T-21 bill that gave us a much stronger, fairer interstate highway system allocation of funds state by state. Recently, we passed the Federal Aviation Administration bill, a $40 billion bill over 3 years to help improve our airport facilities, make sure our airports are safe. We have air traffic controllers, and that we have access to states like Minnesota and Northwest is providing more and more flights in
Even
my
Mississippi,
state.
if somebody wants to go.
Oh yeah, well, Northwest is providing good jet service to Mississippi now, and we like that a lot.
What about the president's budget? I mean, to look at the other side, I mean, these are things that Republicans have been trying to do in both the Senate and the House. The president's budget again this year talks about increasing spending by billions of dollars, $1 trillion in new spending over the next 10 years. This is really going in the wrong direction. Even Alan Greenspan says the worst thing to do is to try to spend all this money. But how do we stack up against the president?
Well, I've had to work with the president as majority leader, and I'm prepared to do that. I'm prepared to work with anybody when I can for the best interest of our country. And for instance, in 1997, we did finally get him in a corner where he had to work with us on Medicare reform and tax relief and spending controls, and we came up with a budget that has led to this balanced budget. So along the way, we have done some things with him, but this year's budget from the administration, from the president, is totally a political document. It's about trying to get the vice president elected to office. It's not a serious budget. But we'll look through it, and where he has some proposals that are worth considering, we'll do that. You know, he's got some proposals in education that we might be interested in. One of them is to provide more assistance to middle-income families whose children want to go to college. Maybe we can do something with that. But basically, it's just more money everywhere without any organization and without any thought of what it will do to the long-term budget. Actually, I think they would like to spend all possible available money this year so we don't have room for responsible tax relief in the future.
It's funny how tax cuts are irresponsible, but if we spend the money, or even spend a projected surplus, that somehow that is responsible budget.
Well, you know, it is the people's money.
Yeah.
And now that we have a surplus, that means that people are paying more than we need to spend each year. They ought to get that back. And when I think about that, I'm not talking about some guy that owns a plant by himself. I'm thinking about the shipyard worker that's out there welding ships together. I'm talking about the paper mill worker, and you've probably got some paper mills up there in Minnesota. I'm talking about the waitress out there is holding down 2 jobs, try to help her African-American son be president of the student body at the University of Mississippi. She needs a little encouragement, a little relief, so that she can do more for that young son that's doing a fantastic job in his college career. And we need to make sure that that young man does have financial aid, scholarships and loans and grants so he can get that good education.
I know we're talking an awful lot of time on taxes, but this is April, I guess, if we're going to talk about it. But one quick question before we go to break. The budget itself, the reform process of trying to get to biannual budgets or make it a little bit more streamlined effort so we don't spend as much time just trying to put the budget together. That's an important part, too.
It is important. Now, people say, oh, my goodness, you're talking esoteric budget stuff. But you've worked on this, and you understand that part of the problem now is we're trying to pass a budget and every appropriations bill now every year. It's gotten to where that's about all we do. We don't have enough time for oversight, investigations into how the people's money is being spent. Is this agency really needed? Is this department doing a responsible job? Because we're so consumed in trying to pass the spending bills every year. Biennial budgeting, where we would pass the budget and do our investigations and oversights and authorization bills in 1 year, and the appropriations bills in the second year would be in the people's best interest.
All right. Thanks. We're going to take a break. We'll be back and talk more with Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott right after this.
The average kid doesn't get straight A's.
The average kid could live on French fries.
I could live on pizza and ice cream.
Gummy bears.
The average kid trusts their friends more than anybody.
The average kid is totally bored.
Totally bored.
The average kid has a lot more on their mind than you think.
The average kid is pretty strange.
The average kid has been offered pot.
The average kid thinks everybody else smokes it, but the average kid doesn't.
The average kid is anything but.
It's my birthday. Oh, it's so pretty. Oh, I told you, don't be bringing that weak stuff in here. Yeah. Who's the man? Who's the man?
Exercised lately?
Again, my special guest on this edition of our Washington Report, Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott of Mississippi. Again, Trent, thank you very much for taking time to join us.
Glad to be with you.
Moving from taxes to another important issue, agriculture. The Ag Committee last month passed out finally a crop insurance reform measure, kind of one of those missing parts of the Freedom to Farm bill that we have moving. This is a very important thing that we need to pass on the floor and get to the President hopefully by early summer.
Right. You know, agriculture is very important to our country. And it's very important to your state of Minnesota and to my state of Mississippi. Now in Mississippi we raise cotton, soybeans, we raise some catfish and a lot of timber. Up there in Minnesota you've got a lot more grain crops, row crops than we have. I flew in one time flew into North Dakota and drove across the river into Moorhead, Minnesota.
That's right.
To do an event for Congressman Arlen Stanglin. You remember Arlen, of course. And then I realized why y'all have so much more agriculture than we do. Those long, spaces of agriculture with no hills and no trees. And so you produce a lot of very
You
important
can see yard lights for miles at night across
Absolutely.
parts of Minnesota.
You know, agriculture is very important in our economy. In the last couple of years, we've had to pass disaster relief to help them get through the fact that prices have been depressed and markets haven't been open, and we've had weather problems. But I think that we can help address that by some bigger issues. For instance, we're going to have some debate, and I think you have called for this, on our agriculture sanctions, the use of agriculture as a weapon in foreign policy. Now, there are occasions when, you know, we shouldn't provide these agriculture products, but there ought to be a process that you can go through in putting it in and taking it off. And so we're going to try to get some limits on so-called agriculture sanctions. The other component, you know, for the freedom to farm to work, it involved this opportunity to have more freedom, but it also depended on markets being there and having more markets around the world. And of course, we ran into the problem in you know, the Far East and with China, and those markets didn't quite come through. And then have crop insurance so that if there was a disaster, it would be covered, and it hasn't worked. So now we're working on that. The Agriculture Committee has reported out a bill, a crop insurance bill, and we're going to have it on the floor of the Senate in the month of April. I hope we can come up with a credible, good crop insurance program that really does the job for our farmers in America.
You talked about trade and exports, and foreign markets are big. I mean, in Minnesota, about a third of everything we grow is exported, and the majority of that goes to the Far East, and China is a big part of that. What about the problem with the WTO and China's ascension into the World Trade Organization? The president is going to have to get behind this and push it if it's going to pass.
Absolutely, and frankly, he hasn't done much yet. And that situation in Seattle we saw earlier this year, where it just turned into chaos, and then the president came out there and his remarks didn't help. But the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has not been doing as good a job as I had hoped it would. For instance, two of the decisions that they have rendered was against the European Union with regard to bananas and American beef. And yet the European Union has refused to comply with the WTO decision. So we're going to have to keep the pressure on WTO and the European Union to be fair with us in agriculture markets. And then, of course, the other question is the China permanent trade status representation. The president is going to have to really weigh in. We need to do all we can to open those markets up. But the key to both China going into the WTO and to getting the permanent trade status approved through the Congress is agriculture. If agriculture feels like it's fair and it's going to open those markets up, then I think it can get through. But of course, it's going to be posed by labor unions and by you know, I guess certain environmentalists that don't like various aspects of it. But we need to open those markets up. America needs it. We can compete with anybody as long as it's fair.
And before we take a break, just on the issue of dairy, I appreciate the fact that you know, we had this debate last fall, but an agreement with yourself and Senator Daschle that we will be able to have at least an opportunity to debate it again, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. But it's important to our dairy farmers in Minnesota.
Well, I said on the floor that I had talked to Chairman Lugar. He's made a commitment to take another look at the dairy program. I also said in my remarks on the floor that I think that what we have now is a mess, and we need to move toward more open and free market system in dairy. It works everywhere else. It ought to be able to work in dairy.
All right. We'll take a break. We'll be back and talk more with Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott in just a moment.
Over 2 million acres of our wildlands burn each year, and hundreds of homes are lost as a result.
At least 50 homes were burned to the ground. Dozens more were damaged as fires raced through dense brush and steep canyons.
Flames don't know the difference between forest, rangelands, and homes. Learn how you can fireproof your home. For more information, contact your local fire protection agency, state forestry office, or the USDA Forest Service.
And again, our special guest today is Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott of Mississippi. Trent, again, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Rod. I want to say to you, I've been to Minnesota many times for you and for others up there, and I've always enjoyed it. The people up there are just delightful, and I look forward to having a chance to come back soon.
Warm people in kind of a cold state.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Trent, we got to talk about health care as well. You know, the Senate and the House both have passed health care, a Patients' Bill of Rights Plus in conference. What are the prospects of working out some kind of solution on that?
It's going to be worked out. We're going to have a bill. It's going to be a good bill, I believe, and it'll go to the President. I hope he will sign it. There's no question that there are some areas in patients' care or the managed care operations that need to be addressed. We need to make sure that people do have access when they need it. You know, we had a situation in some states where they were being denied their medical records. You can't have that. You've got to have a system where if you get in an automobile accident and you go to an emergency room, you don't have to check in with the HMO to get basic care. I mean, you're bleeding. You don't have time to argue about that. We also have to have some clear, understandable, quick system where if there's a disagreement between the doctor and the patient or the HMO about what care is required or what's needed, there needs to be a review process within that entity. If that's not satisfactory, there needs to be a quick, I mean like in 10 days review outside, and a determination made as to what is the right thing to do. What we don't need is just a lot more lawsuits. What you need is a process that gets you to a decision that will get you the health care you need. If your children inherit, the proceeds from a lawsuit from your estate, that doesn't help a whole lot with your health needs. So I believe we can get a bill that will have enough balance in it, that will provide the assistance and the assurances that patients need, and even the opportunity to file a lawsuit if all else fails. And so we'll get results. That's what we're really looking for.
And prescription drugs, another big issue. I've introduced a bill called Meds, and that is hopefully to target to seniors who need it the most.
Right.
Not to Bill Gates if you want to use a high income level, but for the average senior who has to make a decision between food, housing, and medicines, but very targeted. Any chance of movement on a prescription drug?
I don't know. If the President had really worked with us, we could have probably done it last year, because the Medicare Commission that he and the leaders of Congress appointed came together with a Medicare reform package, including providing prescription drugs for those of up to 135% of poverty. That's where we're going to wind up being, or maybe a little bit above that, but we need to make it a part of broader reform so that Medicare is not weighted down by it, but those that really need it are provided that help.
And in the minute we have left, what about the energy picture? Everybody's talking about the high prices of fuel. You know, farmers getting to the fields now later this month. Our truckers, just industry in general. But the Department of Energy, to make us energy independent, hasn't done a very good job over 25 years.
We've known for 25 years, since we had the lines back in the late 70s, I guess it was, that we didn't have an energy plan. That's right. And we still don't.
Still don't.
But that's the first thing we need to recognize. This shouldn't be a surprise. It shows we're still dependent on OPEC oil. That's dangerous. In the short term, we probably need to release some of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which would tend to lower prices some. I think we need to look at gasoline or diesel taxes in particular, which would help the truckers and the farmers. The longer term, we've got to acknowledge we don't have a plan to deal with this. We need to encourage opening up of oil and gas resources, incentives for people to explore, and alternative sources of energy. Maybe this will be the wake-up call we will listen to.
Yeah, if for 25 years you said you can't explore for oil, you're going to get into this position. We're more dependent on foreign oil than we were 25 years ago.
That's correct.
Trent, thank you very much. My thanks again for taking time to join us on our program.
Glad to be with you, Ryan.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back again next month. Thank you. Bye now.